And so we now know that Secretary of State John Kerry will visit Ukraine this week. It's an important sign of solidarity with the Ukrainian people. But what else should the U.S. be doing? How is the president handling this, the latest crisis, responding to Russian President Vladimir Putin? Here are our political insiders: John LeBoutillier, who is a former Republican congressman for New York; Pat Caddell, a former pollster for President Jimmy Carter and a Fox News contributor; and Doug Schoen, former pollster for President Bill Clinton and a Fox News contributor as well. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Jamie.
Thank you so much for being here. Pat, you join us on remote, but you will not be left out of the conversation because I'm going to start with you and ask you, this is the latest foreign policy question for our president, who is already under fire for, some say, not having a policy, some saying be weak on foreign policy. And then he's up against Putin in this case, who is exerting extreme power and confidence. What does he do?
Well, what the president needs to do is get a backbone. The problem is exactly as we predicted on Political Insiders last week, and I don't think many people did. Putin was going to go in and take over the Crimea, at least, as part of the Ukraine. And now I suspect, and I'd like to hear Doug, he's a real expert on it, that, I think he's not stopped. The problem is no one believes the president. And the president, and I think Vladimir Putin has taken his measure of Barack Obama and decided that what he sees is another Neville Chamberlain. John Kerry today said this is not the way you behave in the 21st century. It's like the 19th century. No, this is the 20th century. First Sudetenland, then Czechoslovakia. First the Crimea, and then more of Ukraine.
I want to put up this CBS poll. It's very interesting, Doug, because I will ask you what you think.
Please.
We have an image problem working in this country of other nations that we're asking to join us on things and get them to believe that we're strong. But the American people are also being asked, and in terms of President Obama's presidency, they're totally dissatisfied, 59%.
That's great.
What about the rest of the world? How are they feeling about us?
Our ratings around the world, Jamie, are going down for the reasons Pat suggested. Bottom line, we draw red lines in places like Syria. They get crossed. We do nothing. Vladimir Putin actually, from his point of view, had everything to gain with his invasion and has everything to gain going, as Pat suggested, into the rest of eastern Ukraine, which is heavily pro-Russian in its sentiment. We can't and won't stop them. We should have a travel ban, sanctions. We should make it very clear that throughout our international ties, we're going to do everything we can to clamp down on the Russians. Bottom line, 90-minute conversations with Putin, beseeching today by John Kerry. No hard action, no hard decisions. Vladimir Putin has seen that we are, again, a paper tiger.
So it's been window dressing and not a lot of action.
Precisely.
John, can I ask you, what would Ronald Reagan say about all this right now?
It's a good question, because I wonder if Putin would have done it if Ronald Reagan was sitting in the Oval Office. He would be afraid a little bit of trying to gauge what Reagan would do. But let's say, it doesn't matter. Obama is the leader of the free world. It's time to lead. Doesn't mean that we have to fight Russia militarily. There's no stomach for that kind of thing. But there are things we can do to put pain on Putin. Number one, decouple the banking system. So the Russian banking system is unhooked from us. Try to get Western Europe to do the same thing. If that doesn't do it, we look at freezing the Russian leaders' personal bank accounts that are stashed all over Western Europe. Cause pain on them is the one thing. All these interviews, they don't care what John Kerry says on TV. They want to see pain put on them. That will make them think twice about anything else.
Of all the leaders to be up against Putin and to try to get his attention, it probably would take extreme measures like that.
But this has been coming on.
Go ahead, Pat.
And that's the point. It would take some tough measures, which he has not shown in Iran or Syria. The president lives in a bubble world, and, we called it, I think, the send in the clowns foreign policy team. That's what I thought watching Kerry today. You've got to be tough, and people have to know their consequences, because otherwise, look, we're on the 50th. This is the 50th anniversary, the 100th anniversary year of 1914. And it is miscalculation and misunderstanding that can blow up the world. I know a lot of Americans say, oh, we don't have anything of interest in the Ukraine. The problem is, as we've learned in history, you keep this up, he will keep pushing, and then one day something will happen. This is the danger, to be weak, not to be strong.
Not only that, if we're called in to help economically, it could cost our country a lot of money, and I think taxpayers pay attention to that too. And speaking of taxpayers, go ahead, Pat.
No, I just want to ask Doug. I mean, Doug, isn't there I thought NATO had a treaty to defend the Ukraine. Am I wrong?
We have treaty obligations under the 1994 Budapest Agreement. If the Russians violate their sovereignty, we have obligations with the British to go in and support the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians can renuclearize if, in fact, their sovereignty is jeopardized. But bottom line, what you said, Pat, is exactly right. And what John is saying, exactly right. We're not standing up to the Russians. We're not standing up to Putin. No amount of interviews and hand-wringing is going to change that basic fact.
And what, you know, we don't have.
Dangerous.
If you go back to another invasion, Jamie, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, the initial reaction from the first President Bush, first reaction was, I don't want to get involved in that, until Margaret Thatcher said to him, George, it's no time to go wobbly. And then Bush really got it in gear and did a good job. We don't have anybody telling Obama, Angela Merkel, David Cameron, Francois Hollande, someone has to buck up our president and say, you're the leader of the most powerful country. We'll be behind you, but we got to be united, and we've got to stop this now.
Well, I think that's what the three of you are doing, trying to buck up the president to some action. And even NATO spoke out today and said they're condemning what Putin is doing, whether or not that has any strength or not.
It has no effect. Words have no effect. Actions are what counts.
All right, and economic sanctions always hurt.
Right.
We will, I'm sure on the Political Insiders, you'll be talking a lot about this. I'll be teasing the time and place that folks can always be watching you more. Meanwhile, this was pretty interesting. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is facing a firestorm now after claiming that, you know, all those Obamacare horror stories you've been hearing about people who are losing their coverage or not being able to get coverage, he says they're all a lie. John, the thing is, how could you say all of them? Has he talked to every single one of these people? We've had some of these people on who have said, it's true, it's been a horror for me.
Let's take anecdotal evidence out. If you look at the polling that we've used on this show almost every week, the overwhelming majority, we're up sometimes over 60% of the American people now disapprove of Obamacare, including 60% of the uninsured who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of this program. They don't like it.
Just to add to that, some Democrats who actually voted for it have said they wouldn't have if they knew.
They're nervous Nellies.
They want to fix it now. Millions of people have lost their health care, Jamie. To say that their, quote, horror stories are just wholly untrue, made up out of whole cloth, is at the very least illusory, if not plain a total distortion.
And why, as a Democrat, did Harry Reid do this, what you say?
I'm a loyal Democrat. Pat Caddell is a Democrat. We feel that you've got to make policy based on reality. This is just partisan rhetoric designed to get through an election by doubling down on what policies that John suggests quite rightly are unpopular.
Pat?
I think it's worse than that. You know, by 2-1, the American people believe that the people in Washington lie about everything all the time at a level we have never seen in our democracy, and they're right. What we saw with Harry Reid is the big lie projected. Just like Obama lives in a bubble, Harry Reid, who is, by the way, ground zero of corruption in Washington, sits there and makes that comment that he does in the face of reality, because they all live in that political elite bubble. If we say the lie enough and make it big enough and say it enough, we can make it true. The president lives in a bubble in foreign policy that the world is grand. The problem in Washington is no one will tell the truth, even to each other.
Pat,
on both sides, not just the Democrats.
But here you are, two Democrats who are calling him out on it. What did he gain? Pat?
Well, you know what? First thing, he gained nothing. The first thing is to tell the truth in this country. We've lost that idea, and it is an act, and it's supported by the enablers. A lot of the people in the mainstream media who believe their job is to act as political hacks rather than to tell people the truth. In a political class of consultants who make money on whatever we can divide the people with. You saw the numbers you raised, Jamie, about dissatisfaction with the president. But a lot of this has to do, too, with the fact that what we don't have, and we had hearings this week in Jonathan Turley, a liberal professor who I admire a great deal, who said, I'm a supporter of the president's. I agree with it. But we are at a constitutional tipping point because the president is assuming powers that don't exist. And the Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, won't stand up for the institutions. We are on a slippery slope to a banana republic like Venezuela.
Well, let me ask John about that. The pen and paper situation. Well, President Obama will change the things that aren't working, and then we have midterms coming up, so maybe we'll postpone some of these mandates.
That's right. That's what Professor Turley was getting into. Doug has called it an extra constitutional presidency, where he's doing stuff not prescribed by the Constitution. Going back to the first poll you put up, though, think back when you're a kid, you know? The worst thing is not when your parents get mad at you. It's if they say, you know, Jamie, I'm disappointed in you.
Oh, my gosh.
It's a big thing. And that poll didn't say they're dissatisfied with the presidency. They said they're disappointed in the Obama presidency. 5 years in, the verdict is now starting to come clear that he's been a failed president.
Jamie, you have a president who's legislating by fiat, using executive orders, and using just basically not only the power of his pen, but just rhetorical devices to say, don't like that provision, I'll excise it, we'll delay this, as you say, the small and medium-sized businesses mandate. Bottom line, he's eviscerated the legislation.
But would you agree he's legally able to do so?
No, I'm not sure that he is. I think it is a question for the courts to determine.
And we're back now with our political insiders. We're going to talk a little bit Lois Lerner. Hey, Pat, first, Darrell Issa said today that she would testify this week, and then her attorney backtracked. What do we need to know from her exactly, anyway?
Well, we need to, well, first of all, I'm sorry, I've got to say, John, I was in Florida. Your uncle and family want to know why they see me, but not you there. Okay. But having said that, I had to get that out.
Guilty. He's busted.
But anyway, I want to say this about Lois Lerner. Lois Lerner, look, she was the operating officer of the conspiracy at the IRS. What we need from her is the truth. The Republicans, as I have said specifically, really want the IRS, for instance, to go after the Tea Parties. They're not serious. They just occasionally do this, and maybe Darrell Issa is, but not the leadership. But look, well, the real missing thing, as it was in the Turley thing, is we're talking about using the Internal Revenue Service against groups. It will be used against Democratic groups. And my cry is, where is any Democrat with principle willing to stand up and say, we need to know the truth? It's just killing me.
You know, we already learned that it wasn't just the one office of the IRS. It was a much bigger project to target conservative groups, including the Tea Party. But she took the fifth. We're in disagreement, Doug and I. I say her Fifth Amendment privilege was waived when she gave her opening statement. We'll find out what they rule on that.
Well, first of all, let's look at this thing. The chairman of the committee asked to come on Chris Wallace this morning. They teased a big announcement. And he comes on and says, I'm announcing that Lois Lerner is going to testify Wednesday. Then a couple hours later, we hear that she's not going to testify
and
Wednesday.
Without immunity. I asked Chris, is she coming?
Immunity.
No deal made.
How can this guy run an investigation if he can't even get one fact right before he goes on television? That's number one. And number two, forget Lois Lerner. This issue is much bigger than Lois Lerner. This is what Pat touched on. This is the corruption of the IRS for political purposes. When Nixon mused about using the IRS to go after his enemies, they had an article of impeachment in the House Judiciary Committee.
Maybe there was more transparency then. We'll have to see. But you know what, just to clarify, her attorney says she will testify, but she will show up this week, ask for a week delay, and if she gets it, then she may testify.
But, you know, she is being used as a political pawn in a bigger game, which plays into what Pat and John are talking about. Basically, the corruption of our entire federal government, the politicization of the investigatory process. I don't happen to think that she believes she's waived her Fifth Amendment right, whether or not, in fact, Jamie, to be fair to you, she has, in fact, done it. I think it's going to be more political circus, more political theater. Bottom line, we're not going to learn anything from her, I don't believe, except that our government is irretrievably and irrevocably broken.
You know, I pretty much have to leave it.
At the same time, the IRS is planning even bigger attacks because not even the Republicans will stand up for themselves. And with this thing, when you let corruption go unabated, it just gets worse and more dangerous.
You know what I was going to say? I definitely want folks to check in with all of you and continue the conversation with the political insiders on our website, foxnews.com, every Monday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern at live.foxnews.com. And you know what, guys? Tonight, it's the Oscars, the Academy Awards. Perhaps there should be an award show for the theater that's going on in Washington.
Absolutely.
Right? All right, well, that's going to do it for us. Thanks, guys, so much for being with us.